Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is rack. And this is another verb that the viewer Louise suggested, so thank you so much for this idea. Let's take a look now at some of the ways we can use this verb. The first way you might hear rack used can mean to cause extreme physical or mental pain to someone. We're going to see some examples of that a little bit later in the video. But for now, we'll move on to the second definition, which is related to subject someone to extreme stress. And that stress then might be causing them physical or mental pain. A third way the verb rack gets used, and it's more of in a historical context, was a method of torture. So people would be strapped to this particular instrument, right, and sort of stretched in opposite directions, a very painful death. It isn't generally happening here in 2024, but if you're reading historical texts, you might encounter that definition used in that text. A fourth way you can use the verb rack is during the play of billiards. So it's when you place the pool balls into that triangular rack, which will be a noun that we discuss a little bit later. A fifth way rack gets used can mean to stretch or strain violently. So that definition probably comes from that historical one about the method of torture. For now, you should know that rack is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing, and that forms racking. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Now our base verb, rack, ends in an unvoiced sound. The K sound is unvoiced. And that means our ed ending is just going to make a T sound. So it should sound like this. Racked, racked. Okay. There is another phrasal verb with a slightly different definition I thought we could discuss. You might encounter the verb rack up. And it can mean that someone has achieved or scored something, but it could also mean to accumulate, so kind of build up. Now, with that achieve and score meaning, I think you'll hear this or see it used in connection to sports many times. So this team has racked up so many wins, or this player has racked up so many points. Again, meaning they've scored. My example here is going to go to that third meaning of accumulate. So an example of it might be, they have racked up over $50,000 in credit card debt. Right? So they've been using their credit card, spending, maybe making those minimum payments, right? So the debt has built up or accumulated. Now, before we move on to a little verb tense practice, today I thought it might be good to review active and passive voice. It's been a little while since I've done that in one of my videos. Most of the time, as I do verb tense practice, both in my classes and here on my YouTube channel, the majority of things are done in the active voice, and that is certainly what you hear and see most frequently. An active voice sentence begins with the person or the thing, that's your subject, that is responsible for the action. You might think of it as sort of the person doing the action. Sometimes that helps people picture it better. But occasionally, you will read or hear people speaking in the passive voice. Passive voice sentences begin with the person or thing that is acted on or acted upon. Helps sometimes for students to think about those are the people or things receiving the action. Okay. Sometimes in our passive voice sentences, we don't even note who is responsible for the action. But if we do want to indicate that, it generally comes at the end of the sentence after the preposition by. I have a couple example sentences on my screen that I think sometimes can help us kind of think through that. So in the active voice, I might say, Tim cleaned the house yesterday, right? Tim is the person who is responsible for the action, right? But I could make that same sentence in the passive voice, right? And the thing receiving the action is the house. So my sentence is going to begin with it. The house was cleaned by Tim. So here, these are both past tense sentences, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I'm using a past form of be, and then I'm using the participle form of the verb. Okay. So I've got two other examples. Leslie wrote notes, right? So wrote is past tense, right? I could also just say notes were written, or notes were written by Leslie. Okay. Now, the question I get from most students when we talk about this in class is, why? Why do we have this? And this exists in many languages, not just English. And there are different reasons that people use the passive voice. One reason might be that sometimes the person or the thing that's responsible for the action, we just don't know who it is, right? So we don't know who the subject is. So it's a little easier just to say what receives the action. And here, note that it's complete because it's a simple past tense. Another reason might be the person doing the thing is not all that important, right? We don't want our listener maybe to focus on that because we really want to emphasize or stress the thing or person that is receiving the action that is acted on, right? And by starting our sentence with that, just naturally people's attention focuses a little more closely on it. Now, another reason that passive voice gets used is sometimes to talk about negative things, bad things that happen. And instead of sort of saying, this person did this bad thing, it might be a little just easier to say this bad thing occurred, right? Without assigning blame. So as I thought about how I hear people use rack as a verb, my mind immediately went to the passive voice. And I want to give you some examples. I think it's pretty common to hear rack used in the passive voice, especially connected to some of those first couple definitions that we used. So as we look on the screen here, I'm going to ask you first to look in the rightmost column where it says simple past tense, passive voice. Okay. An example of a sentence you might encounter, he was racked with guilt, right? So, and you might be thinking, well, that sounds like a normal sentence, but that feeling, that the experiencing of mental pain here is actually kind of the person is the one being acted on. So I know that might seem a little confusing, but I think here it's again kind of to focus on how someone is feeling in this particular way. Now, we could just say guilt racked him, right? That is the thing causing this particular action, and that's a fine sentence, but I do think a little more common to hear that passive voice, was racked. Okay, let's look at a negative passive voice sentence. Okay, so again, we're starting with the thing we acted on, or in this case, not, since it's negative. We're using past form of be and our participle form of the verb. So, the shoes weren't racked in the showroom. So here, kind of placed on a clothing or display structure. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second as well. That might be something a salesperson says to another, right? Trying to avoid the blame, saying, you didn't do this. But to say it in the active voice, we might say, no employee racked the shoes in the showroom, or employees didn't rack the shoes in the showroom. That would also have a similar meaning, right? But here we're saying who's responsible for the action. Okay. Finally, let's look at making yes or no questions in the simple past tense. In the passive voice, we start with a form of be, then we have that object followed by our participle form of the verb. So we might ask, was her body racked by pain? Okay. Said another way, in the active voice, did pain rack her body? Right? So all of these things are going to have the same meaning as just how we stress certain words, or maybe what we want listeners to focus on as we are speaking. Now, let's spend a little bit of time talking about some of those words and phrases that are related to rack. And I sort of mentioned earlier in the video that rack can also be used as a noun. As a noun, that word has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation, and it can have a number of different meanings. So one way might be talking about some kind of framework. I might think of like furniture in a way. In which something is placed. Something could be held there, it could be hung, or it could be displayed. So many times in stores, you're going to hear this noun used, like in my example sentence. Have you checked that rack for your size? Right? And so if you look in the bottom corner here of the screen, I've got a little picture. You can see a lot of clothes on a hanger. It might be a little hard to see kind of the bar suspending that's holding or hanging these items. You might hear that called a clothing rack. Some people have a shoe rack in their home, a way to hold and maintain kind of in an orderly fashion their shoes. Now, I mentioned earlier a second way to use this noun rack is in the sport of billiards, right, or pool. So it's this triangular thing. And so you use it at the beginning of the game to get things sort of organized before it starts. So after you've done that organizing, right, you're ready to play the game, you might say to someone, put the rack under the table, right? So we're talking about that triangular shape. A third way to use the noun rack relates to animals that have antlers, right? So it's talking about those set, so both parts of the antlers. An example of how you might hear that used. That deer had the most impressive rack I've seen, right? So I'm talking about the deer's antlers. Now I have a couple phrases that you might occasionally encounter. You might hear someone talking about racking their brain or brains, right? It gets used both singular and plural there. It really just means someone is trying very hard to remember or think of something. An example of this might be, she's been racking her brain trying to remember where she put the form, right? Maybe this has happened to you where you think you have something in a certain spot and it's not there, and then you have to sit and think, okay, where did I put this, right? And here, when you really can't find something, this action of trying hard to remember might continue for a while. Another phrase you might encounter is off the rack. What this means is usually in connection to clothes, they're talking about something that is ready-made. It could even be something that has used or been worn by another person. The idea here is that it is not customized, right? So it has not been sewn just for you. Okay? An example of how you might hear this used, the actress wore an off-the-rack dress to the movie premiere. So just means she bought it from a store, right? This particular dress was not designed and made for her or for exclusively her. Okay. Now, this is not a phrase one might use a lot. Most people don't or can't afford to have customized clothing, so it tends to be for a very small percentage of our population. Thanks again to Luis for suggesting today's verb. Thank you all for watching. Have a great day.